Brynner stood on a carefully constructed mound of sand in the merciless Cuernavaca heat and watched. Steve McQueen circled him like a hungry wolf studying wounded prey, knowing that the real battle for the bise. Magnificent Seven had nothing to do with Mexican bandits and everything to do with two massive egos, fighting for screen dominance in a war that would define both their careers and destroy their friendship forever. Summer 1960, 108 degrees in the desert sun, 7 heroes in front of the cameras and behind. Them two titans locked in psychological combat that made actual gunfights look like children's games. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's most intense Hollywood rivalries, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments where legendary egos collided in unforgettable wars of will and ambition. The 40-year-old Brynner commanded the set with the absolute authority that had made him Broadway royalty and Hollywood gold, his bald head gleaming like polished marble in the desert sun, his black gunfighter costume creating an imposing silhouette that directors framed with religious reverence. Everything about his presence announced that he was not just the star of this production, but its undisputed king, the man whose name appeared first in the credits and whose approval could make or break every scene. But 30-year-old Steve McQueen moved through that same desert like a caged predator who had grown tired of captivity, his blue eyes constantly calculating angles and opportunities, his every gesture designed to steal focus from whoever happened to be delivering dialogue. The young actor had arrived on set hungry for the kind of stardom that Brynner took for granted, and his hunger was beginning to manifest as open rebellion against the established hierarchy. The tension had been building for weeks, fed by 100 small conflicts and petty jealousies that turned professional disagreements into personal vendettas. McQueen resented taking orders from a man he considered a relic of an earlier Hollywood era. Brynner despised being challenged by someone he viewed as an undisciplined amateur who confused attitude with talent. Director John Sturges tried to maintain peace between his warring stars, but every day brought new provocations, new insults, new evidence that the legendary camaraderie of the 7 magnificent heroes existed only when the cameras were rolling. The first major battle erupted over something as simple as height. At 5'9", Brynner was not naturally imposing in the way that John Wayne or Gary Cooper commanded attention through sheer physical presence, but he had learned to compensate through careful positioning, strategic camera angles, and when necessary, the discreet use of platforms and elevated positions that made him appear taller than his actual stature. The sand mounds were a masterpiece of subtle manipulation, small hills carefully constructed by the art department to give Brynner those crucial extra inches that translated into visual dominance on screen. When he stood on his elevated position delivering Chris Adams' philosophical speeches about justice and sacrifice, he looked every inch the natural leader that the role required. Steve McQueen discovered these artificial elevations during the second week of filming and immediately, the man, adjusted their purpose. More importantly, he recognized an opportunity for sabotage that was both subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation and effective enough to undermine Brynner's carefully constructed authority. The first incident happened during a crucial scene where Chris Adams explains the moral obligations of hired guns to the frightened villagers. Brynner took his position on the carefully prepared mound, straightened to his full height, plus the extra inches provided by the hidden platform, and began delivering the speech that would establish his character's philosophical foundation. But something was wrong. The sand beneath his feet felt unstable, uncertain, like standing on loose gravel instead of solid ground. When Brynner shifted his weight during a particularly important line about courage and conviction, the entire mound collapsed beneath him, sending him stumbling forward in a completely undignified scramble to maintain his balance. "Cut!" Sturges called, confusion evident in his voice. "What happened to the platform?" The art department rushed forward to examine the destruction, finding that the carefully packed sand had been loosened and disturbed, as if someone had kicked it apart just before filming began. But who would do such a boagaba thing? And why? Brynner's dark eyes swept the assembled cast and crew, looking for signs of guilt or satisfaction that might reveal the saboteur. His gaze lingered on Steve McQueen, who stood nearby examining his fingernails with studied indifference, but there was no obvious evidence of wrongdoing. "Rebuild it," Brynner ordered coldly, "and this time, make sure it's properly secured." But the next day brought another collapse. And the day after that, another. Every time Brynner took his elevated position for an important speech or dramatic moment, the sand would give way at the crucial instant, destroying the scene's impact and forcing embarrassing retakes that ate into the production schedule. After the fourth incident, Brynner understood that he was under attack. This wasn't equipment failure or unfortunate accident. This was deliberate sabotage designed to undermine his authority and make him appear foolish in front of the entire production. The question was whether he could prove who was responsible. The answer came during a dawn shoot when Brynner arrived early and concealed himself behind a prop wagon to observe the set preparation. In the gray pre-sunrise light, he watched Steve McQueen approach his carefully constructed platform and systematically kick apart the sand foundation with the methodical precision of a sombrero. Someone who had done this many times before. The revelation hit Brynner like a physical blow. Not just the confirmation of sabotage, but the calculated nature of it. McQueen wasn't acting from sudden impulse or momentary spite, but from a deliberate campaign to destroy his co-star's credibility through accumulated humiliation. When McQueen finished his destruction and walked away whistling, Brynner remained hidden for several minutes, processing what he had witnessed and planning his response. He could confront McQueen directly, but that would create the kind of public scene that would damage both their reputations and possibly derail the entire production. He could report the sabotage to Sturges, but proving deliberate misconduct would require evidence he didn't possess. Instead, Brynner chose a different approach, one that would demonstrate exactly why he had survived and thrived in Hollywood long enough to become a genuine star, while McQueen was still scrambling for cub squee recognition. The Sand Wars escalated into psychological warfare. If McQueen wanted to play games with physical props, Brynner would respond by demonstrating the difference between amateur disruption and professional dominance. He began using his considerable experience and established authority to systematically isolate McQueen from the casual camaraderie that made film sets bearable during long desert shoots. When the cast gathered for meals, Brynner's table became the center of conversation while McQueen found Mafety himself eating alone. When directors and producers visited the set, they naturally gravitated toward the established star rather than the rising newcomer. When journalists arrived to write articles about the production, Brynner made sure that their attention focused on the film's dramatic themes rather than any individual performer's attempts to steal scenes. McQueen responded by escalating his own campaign of subtle sabotage. During Brynner's dramatic monologues, the carefully crafted speeches that established Chris Adams as the moral center of the story, McQueen would position himself in the background and begin a series of distracting activities designed to pull audience attention away from the speaker. He would adjust his hat repeatedly, creating movement that caught the eye. He would fiddle with his gun belt, producing small sounds that interfered with dialogue recording. He would shift his weight from foot to foot, creating a visual rhythm that competed with the speaker's verbal cadences. The techniques were subtle enough that they couldn't be called obvious scene stealing, but effective enough that they consistently undermined the impact of Brynner's most important moments. Directors found themselves doing multiple takes of crucial scenes, not because of dialogue problems or technical difficulties, but because Something indefinable felt wrong about the energy and focus of the performances. Brynner watched these disruptions with growing fury, recognizing professional sabotage when he saw it but unable to address it directly without appearing paranoid or petty. McQueen's tactics were too subtle for obvious complaint, but too persistent for accidental explanation. The breaking point came during filming of the scene where Chris Adams explains to the village children why good men sometimes have to use violence to protect innocent people. The speech was central to the film's moral philosophy, a moment where Brynner's character reveals the painful wisdom that comes from a lifetime of necessary killing. As Brynner began the delicate emotional work required for the scene, McQueen began his usual background activities, adjusting his hat, shifting his stance, creating the tiny movements and sounds that would destroy the scene's focus. But this time, something in Brynner's performance must have reached him, because, for a moment, McQueen stopped his sabotage and simply listened. The speech was beautiful, profound, delivered with the kind of controlled passion that separated great actors from merely competent ones. For 30 seconds, everyone on set was genuinely moved by the moral complexity of Brynner's character and the skill with which he brought that complexity to life. Then McQueen, perhaps realizing that he had been caught actually appreciating his rival's talent, deliberately dropped his rifle to the ground with a loud clatter that destroyed the scene's emotional climax. "Cut!" Sturges called in exasperation. "Steve, what happened?" "Sorry," McQueen replied with studied casualness. "Gun slipped." That's when Brynner's legendary self-control finally snapped. Moving with the fluid precision that had made him a formidable stage presence, Brynner crossed the set in 3 swift strides and positioned himself close enough to McQueen that their conversation would be private, but their body language would be visible to everyone present. "If you touch that hat one more time during my speeches," Brynner said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I will nail it to your skull. If you drop that rifle again, I will use it to beat you unconscious. And if you think you're spare, little games are clever or amusing, you are about to discover exactly how wrong you can be." The words were delivered with such quiet intensity that McQueen actually stepped backward, suddenly, understanding that he had been playing with forces beyond his control. Brynner's threat wasn't theatrical bluster, it was a promise delivered by someone who had the will and capability to follow through on it. But McQueen was too committed to his campaign to back down completely. "You threatening me, old man? I'm educating you," Brynner replied with deadly calm. "About the difference between talent and ambition, between earning respect and demanding it, between being a professional and being a pest." He moved even closer. Close enough that McQueen could see his own reflection in Brynner's dark eyes. "You want my spotlight? Earn it. You want my respect? Deserve it. You want to steal scenes? Learn to act well, enough that you don't need to rely on cheap tricks and amateur sabotage." The confrontation lasted only moments, but its impact resonated through the remainder of the production. McQueen's sabotage attempts ceased, partly from caution and partly from a grudging recognition that Brynner's dominance was based on genuine superiority rather than mere star privilege, but the damage to their relationship was permanent. For the rest of filming, the two men maintained professional courtesy while conducting a cold war of studied indifference. They performed their scenes together with technical competence while radiating mutual dislike that occasionally enhanced their characters' dynamic but more often created an uncomfortable tension that infected the entire production. The Magnificent Seven became a massive success, launching both men into the highest levels of Hollywood stardom. But their personal conflict continued long after filming wrapped, influencing casting decisions, social dynamics, and professional relationships for years to come. Ironically, it was Steve McQueen who benefited most from the film's success. His rebellious energy and natural charisma connected with audiences in ways that Brynner's more classical authority could not match. The very hunger and ambition that had made him such a disruptive presence on set translated into screen magnetism, that Triana Adihenia made him a major star. Brynner won the immediate battle through superior experience and established authority. But McQueen won the longer war through sheer force of personality and generational appeal. The final chapter of their conflict came nearly 20 years later, in 1980, when McQueen lay dying of cancer in a Mexico clinic. Among the few phone calls he made during his final weeks was one to Yul Brynner, a conversation that neither man ever described publicly, but which those close to both described as profoundly emotional. According to McQueen's widow, the call lasted nearly an hour and included what she characterized as, quote, complete settling of accounts between two men who had spent decades avoiding acknowledgement of their mutual respect. McQueen apparently told Brynner that their conflict on the Magnificent Seven had been the most educational experience of his early career, forcing him to develop the discipline and professionalism that served him throughout his subsequent success. He admitted that his sabotage campaign had been petty and unprofessional, driven by insecurity rather than legitimate grievance. Brynner, according to those close to him, acknowledged that McQueen's hunger and ambition had challenged him to elevate his own performance, and that the tension between them had ultimately served the film even when it made the production miserable for everyone involved. Both men apparently agreed that their conflict had been necessary, a generational clash that reflected larger changes in Hollywood culture and audience expectations. The old studio system that had produced Brynner was Winquation, giving way to the new auteur-driven cinema that would make McQueen an icon. Neither man lived to see how completely their roles would be reversed by history. Brynner's classical authority would come to seem dated and formal, while McQueen's rebellious energy would define cool for generations of prehistory actors who followed. But on that desert set in 1960, they were just two ambitious men fighting for dominance in a business that rarely had room for more than one king at a time. The Magnificent Seven remains their joint masterpiece, a film where their real-life conflict enhanced the fictional drama they were creating together. Sometimes legends are born from hatred as much as inspiration, forged in the heat of rivalry rather than the warmth of collaboration. Their war made them both better actors and bigger stars than they might have become through cooperation alone. In the end, perhaps that was the most magnificent thing about all seven of them, the understanding that greatness sometimes requires conflict, and that the best performances come from actors who refuse to settle for being anyone's shadow.